This is the presentation for Chapter 33, The Great Depression and the New Deal, 1933 to 1939. And this will kind of focus on FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his presidency, especially during the Great Depression. I pledge to you a New Deal for the American people. We're going to be focusing on his New Deal. FDR's New Deal is his approach to solving, his governmental approach to solving this Great Depression. The country needs, and Democrats' bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. So even Roosevelt's critics didn't necessarily like some of his solutions, some of his answers, but they always said at least he's doing something. Alright, so I'm going to try to cover briefly the Great Depression, and we'll try to keep it short and cruise through this fairly quickly. A reminder that all the images within this presentation are in the public domain, and please do not hesitate to give me an email or a phone call if you have any questions. So as the stock market crashes in 1929, Hoover is being blamed then for spending the next 3 years doing very little, at least very little in the area of government aid. And so the nation, especially when it comes to joblessness, the job rate, the unemployment rate in the United States is awful, and really throughout the world. So these are just a couple of images. Men and women, but men in particular, searching for work, and work is just not available. And people moving up, packing up, and searching desperately for work. And so you have soup lines, you have people on the corner, street corner, selling apples, and just very quickly, the United States economic situation became very desperate. And that's for 3 years, even with Hoover as president. Roosevelt comes into this scenario and tries to give the nation some relief. Just a few more images here. Homelessness. You have the shanty towns in the outskirts of big cities, sometimes referred to as Hoovervilles. You can see this kid is trying to sell apples for a nickel. You have people lost their fortunes, and this guy's trying to sell his car for $100 just to get some cash, pay some bills, and these guys, of course, probably have been foreclosed upon, and they are packing up and moving out, looking for a better life. This is one of the most famous photographs of the Great Depression, and you can see the family living in a tent. And in some ways, this photograph is more famous for what is not included. There is not a husband. There's not a father figure. The anguish on the mother's face. The potential starving kids. Just a very famous photo. It's called The Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was the photographer. So the election of 1932 becomes a landslide for Roosevelt. Famous story was that the night of the election, Hoover received a telegram, and it said, "Hoover, please vote for Roosevelt, make it unanimous." But if you can imagine in today's society a presidential candidate getting 89% of the popular vote and winning just about every state. So Roosevelt becomes president. Roosevelt wants to throw the outsiders, or the spenders, out, attached the Republican old dealers. Happy days are here again. Some of that was also then because Prohibition was ended, and so happy days obviously were going to come back quickly. 1932 presidential campaign. One of the advantages that Roosevelt had then as a president with huge landslide numbers is that Roosevelt gained a large statistical proportion in both the United States Senate and the United States House. This allowed Roosevelt then to put his New Deal together, consisting of relief, recovery, and reform. But Roosevelt was able to put together a New Deal program and push more measures through the United States Congress in the first 100 days than most presidents are able to accomplish in their entire 4-year term. Now, this New Deal is sometimes referred to as alphabet soup because of the 15 different measures. They were all remembered by their initials. So the Federal Depository Insurance Company, the FDIC, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Amendment or Administration, the Tennessee Valley Administration. All of these were known for their initials, so it's alphabet soup. First thing Roosevelt did is to close all banks and try to initiate a bank holiday, and those banks that were solvent, those banks that were good and cleared any kind of background investigation, then those banks were allowed to reopen, and people were encouraged to take their money and now deposit the money into good banks. Then these banks would in turn be insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Company. So this is, let me assure my firm belief that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And this was very important. He wanted America to become more confident in our economic system once again and put their money back in the banking system. One way to restore confidence in America, Roosevelt took the initiative to deliver weekly radio addresses, and he called these his fireside chats. And so Roosevelt addressed the nation, trying to calm everybody's nerves and trying to restore confidence in America's economic foundation. These are some of the more famous administrations or organizations within the New Deal. So you have the National Recovery Act, sometimes known as the Blue Eagle. You had the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a government agency that hired young men to go out to Colorado to plant trees, to go out to Kansas and to plant shelter belts to protect against wind. The Work Program Initiative, or the Public Works Program, and the WPA. These are all programs to help with employment, also to build public works such as the Hoover Dam, but then also dams throughout all of Tennessee, potentially even stadiums for high schools, other kind of public works, schools and roads, bridges. These were all kind of employment programs by the federal government to shock us out of unemployment, shock us out of the Great Depression economically. So the Works Progress Administration was responsible for 650,000 miles of road, 78,000 bridges, and one of the more controversial parts of the WPA was the pieces of arts, the pieces of art, the concerts. Is it really the government's job to hire artists? That became controversial, but it was something that was done nonetheless. One of those artists that was paid by the WPA was John Steinbeck, and his famous work of literature, The Grapes of Wrath. And so if you ever have a chance to read that or watch that video, it's very characteristic of the time. It's about this family who migrates from Oklahoma out to California looking for work in the fields. They end up finding jobs working in a peach picking farm, but it's definitely, you can tell that John Steinbeck is receiving government funds for this book because it is a portrayal of the good that government can do in this time of economic need. some of the other famous public work WPA projects in Wichita. We have the federal building. It was the post office for some time, but the construction of this federal building on North Market in Wichita was done during the Great Depression. And then inside of this building we have murals that were painted, and the artists were paid by the WPA. So is it the job of our government to pay artists to decorate these public buildings? That's just a question. It became kind of controversial during this New Deal phase of the Great Depression. Other big government spending on projects, we have the famous Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. This was a project putting people to work during the Great Depression, sponsored by the government. Tennessee Valley Authority, hundreds of dams put together in Tennessee to help give people jobs, also to control flooding, and then also provide electricity to the region. Very successful. We of course then have the famous Hoover Dam. It's a construction project putting people to work and then also providing for electricity in the region to help spur the economic activity. And then we have also a dam in Washington State on the Columbian River, the Grand Coulee Dam. So all of these huge construction projects paid for by the federal government to help spark us out of the Great Depression. At least that was the intention. Now, the very famous aspect of the Great Depression was the Dust Bowl that occurred. Dust Bowl occurring in the panhandle of Oklahoma and the southwest of Kansas, the southeast of Colorado. So the Dust Bowl region, and these are some amazing photographs here of people waking up in the morning thinking that there were huge thunderstorms coming, but realizing very quickly that these are all dust clouds. And I have an assignment for you to answer some questions and to watch about a 45-minute video about the Dust Bowl, and it's one of the more fascinating videos from this time. We also had the creation of Social Security in 1935. The Social Security was part of Roosevelt's New Deal. This was to provide for some aid to those elderly people who lost both their work and their life savings in the bank scandals and the bank collapse. So Social Security was a direct consequence of Roosevelt's New Deal. At the end of Roosevelt's first New Deal, we have a 1936 election 4 years later, and this is an even bigger landslide victory for Roosevelt. If you look here, 98% of the popular vote, and even the electoral vote is even more in favor of Roosevelt, if you can imagine. 1936. His opponent was Landon. Landon was a Kansan, and even Kansas votes for the Democrat Roosevelt, not their own candidate from their own state. So if you look at the election, of course, 523 electoral votes is ridiculous. So Roosevelt feels like he has another huge mandate. Again, huge proportional advantages in both the House and the Senate. So Roosevelt wants to launch even more measures to combat this Great Depression. Despite Roosevelt's landslide victory and his mandate to create a second New Deal, we have some conflicts between Roosevelt and the Supreme Court. And at the time, Roosevelt believed that the Supreme Court should get in line with the the Supreme Court of public opinion. Roosevelt was having certain of his New Deal measures being struck down as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court was starting to step in the way of Roosevelt's New Deal. And several of these justices on the Supreme Court were, in Roosevelt's opinion, old and out of touch with reality. So Roosevelt wanted to inject vigorous new blood. The President of the United States has the authority, according to the Constitution, to appoint justices based on Senate's approval. And there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States to say that the Supreme Court must consist of only 9 judges. So Roosevelt was going to increase the court. His plan was to increase the court from 9 to 15. So he would inject 6 vigorous new judges onto the Supreme Court. And these vigorous new judges would, of course, then vote how Roosevelt told them to vote. This was a problem. In the nick of time, Congress, remember, the Senate has to approve of Roosevelt's plan or Roosevelt's appointments. Congress votes Roosevelt's plan down. Roosevelt is not able to appoint extra men on the bench. And so sometimes it's referred to as a switch in time saves 9. Controversially enough, several of these judges that did remain decided to change some of their votes, and so some of Roosevelt's more controversial New Deal measures, some were struck down, but some survived. So the packing of the court is something that you might want to look into. It's very controversial. Roosevelt's power is checked by the legislative branch, just as the Founding Fathers had intended. But Roosevelt, a very strong and popular president, already is going to consider here in the next election to break the tradition of running for president for 3 terms, and then he actually gets elected to a 4th term. Roosevelt then also takes this idea, this tradition, this custom of only having 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Roosevelt tries to pack the bench with a few of his buddies and to get the Supreme Court to do exactly what he wants. So this is kind of controversial, kind of a big theme from Roosevelt's presidency. Justice Hugo Black was appointed by Roosevelt and one of the oldest conservatives, and he resigns. Kind of this switch in time saves 9. He resigns, and that kind of alleviates the situation. Roosevelt is able to appoint 1 justice to replace Hugo Black, but that kind of, spend some time reading in the chapter about the Supreme Court and Roosevelt. And as I mentioned before, we had 2 huge landslide victories in 1932, Roosevelt's first term, and then again in 1936. Roosevelt then runs as a 3rd-term president. World War II has already started. World War II starts in 1939. The United States is not involved in it yet. Roosevelt wants to run and decides to run for a 3rd term, 1940. He gets elected in November of 1940, and then in December of 1941 we have Pearl Harbor, and so the United States gets into the war, and Roosevelt runs then for a 4th term in 1944. So every time, if you look at the popular vote, even his 4th election, Roosevelt wins 81% of the popular vote. It's an amazing percentage. The electoral vote's a little closer, but it doesn't matter. He becomes president nonetheless. Look at this, 84%. So that kind of concludes a very short presentation on the Great Depression. We could probably spend a full semester just talking about the Great Depression. But just a reminder that all the images within this presentation are in the public domain, and please do not hesitate to give me a call or an email if you have any questions. Thank you.